Okay, well, welcome to the third annual Yale Law School Doctoral Conference. I'm Gordon Silverstein. I'm the Assistant Dean for Graduate Programs here at the Law School. And I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to Yale and to New Haven. The weather is cooperating, as it usually does. It's really perfect weather for spending 2 days indoors and fully engaging in this intellectual piece without being distracted by warm, sunny days. So the theme this year, I think, is particularly appropriate. Set up for you and that you're participating in. Yale's doctoral students have assembled really a stellar lineup of students from around the country and around the world. I'm really very pleased that you could join us. Before introducing our keynote speaker, I want to single out our conference organizers who poured enormous time and energy and thought into what has rapidly become one of Yale Law School's signature events. And we really do appreciate their efforts on this. So I should also note that we're using a number of different buildings today. They're all adjacent to the law school. So this is the Hall of Graduate Studies, or HGS. You may see that referred to. The Sterling Library, which is the main university library, which is across the street from the law school, and then, of course, rooms in the law school itself. So pay attention to any announcements or any posters if you're trying to find a session. And obviously, any of us would be happy to help you. Tomorrow, all the events are in the law school building. So let me just briefly introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Heather Gerken is the J. Scully Wright Professor of Law at Yale Law School. She's published widely and well with particular focus on election law, lobbying, campaign finance, constitutional law, and recently with an intensifying focus on federalism, which she's going to talk about today. She's an award-winning teacher at both Yale and Harvard Law School. She did her undergraduate work at Princeton University. She earned her JD at the University of Michigan, before taking up a clerkship with Judge Reinhardt on the Ninth Circuit and then with U.S. Supreme Court Justice David Souter. Professor Gerken joined the faculty of Harvard Law School in 2000 and then came to her senses and moved to New Haven. And joined and joined the faculty here in 2006. We're really, really delighted that she did so. Professor Gerken's work is an example of important scholarship that addresses deep, important issues of concern to scholars and makers alike. Recently, she's been deeply engaged with questions about federalism, and particularly questions concerning horizontal federalism. She's a powerful voice that's leading us to rethink the role of federalism and its impact on our politics and policy, and I'm really very, very pleased that she could join us here this morning.
Thank you very much. So it is a cold and rainy and disgusting day, and I figured when it's this early, I thought the best way to give a talk is to throw a bunch of bombs. So I just want to give you a little bit of a warning. There are some rather strong claims in this speech. They are softer in the article that will eventually come of it, although that's mostly because God invented footnotes. So just imagine very moderate, sensible, sane footnotes rolling behind on the screen behind me as I talk to you. So I want to talk a little bit about federalism and what I think of as the new federalism. So in many ways, a lot of my work has been addressed to what I think of as the new federalism. So the old schools of federalism and American federalism focus a lot on sovereignty or at least autonomy. They have a certain conception of what national-state relations ought to look like. And I basically think most of them are wrong as a descriptive matter and not nearly as attractive as people think they are as a normative matter. So I want to talk to you about different parts of federalism. So I'm going to talk about, in a way, about federalism that might not seem familiar to you. And I hope for those of you who come from other places that this is focused on American federalism in particular. So I don't want to make claims more broadly about federalism. So this paper is about the loyal opposition, which I think is one of democracy's grandest terms. It was once used to shield the party out of power from accusations of treason, but it now describes an effort to institutionalize opposition, most famously Great Britain's elevation of the minority party leadership to a shadow cabinet. It was once termed, quote, the greatest contribution of the 19th century to the art of government, but in some ways it's a stand-in for the best practices of democracy. Tolerance of one's opponents, a recognition of the values associated with dissent, the integration of outsiders into democracy's fabric. Well, I have a lot more to say about the history and evolution. Here, I just want to use the term loosely as an interpretive tool. So I know it is a term of art, and I'm going to abandon the term of art and just use the phrase itself, because the phrase itself perfectly captures one of the basic aims of democracy, creating an opposition that is loyal. How do we build loyalty while licensing opposition? How do we show loyalty to the opposition whose loyalty we in turn demand? How do we think about the institutional dimensions of integration? Now, the term loyal opposition is not often, almost never used in American debates because we think we lack an institutional structure for allowing minorities to take part in governance. So in this view, Americans have found their own way to build loyalty while licensing opposition. It's been a rights-based strategy, not an institutional one. So we understand ourselves to have made room for oppositional politics through the First Amendment and the 15th. I should say the 14th, here's my footnote. The 14th as well, but I'll just use the 15th for ease of exposition. So we don't give democracy's outliers a formal role in the government, so the story goes, but we do ensure that they have every opportunity to influence the debate and take part in the decisions. In the United States, rights are understood to be the means for achieving racial and political integration, and diversity has become the measure of our success. That story isn't just wrong, it's not nearly as attractive a tale as we make it out to be. An unduly narrow focus on rights, combined with some genuinely ugly history, has led us to endorse what I think are as thin, even anemic visions of integration, and has led us to adopt a measure of democratic legitimacy that turns out to involve relatively little power for those it's supposed to empower. Now, there were times when toleration was sufficient and guaranteeing the right to vote was enough. Indeed, there were times when protecting the opposition's right to speak was an act of statesmanship, and the mere existence of a diverse decision-making body was a miraculous achievement. Today, however, these concessions to democracy's outliers have become too easy for those in the majority. Or perhaps easy isn't the right word. Maybe the problem is that they've become too convenient. Fortunately, we do, in fact, have more to offer to democracy's outliers than the right to speak and the right to vote. We do, in fact, have a strategy for institutionalizing opposition. We do, in fact, have our own form of loyal opposition in the United States, one that is distinctively American and arguably more robust than its counterparts elsewhere. It's called federalism. Now, the trouble is, in the United States, nationalists don't recognize federalism or its homely cousin, localism, as a form of loyal opposition. They don't recognize decentralization to be either a means of integrating or a measure of integration. They don't understand devolution to be a gesture of loyalty toward the opposition, whose loyalty we in turn demand. To the contrary, nationalists view federalism with suspicion at best, in large part because they pride themselves on showing the greatest loyalty to democracy's outliers. The nationalist case against decentralization, after all, rests largely on the shameful role federalism has played in legitimating the oppression of racial minorities and dissenters. To be sure, nationalists recognize that federalism has the ability to empower the opposition, but they have grave doubts as to whether that particular opposition is loyal. As a result, in thinking about the grand constitutional project of integration, nationalists privilege rights over governance, courts over politics, participation over power, outsiders over insiders, and minority rights over minority rule. And that is a mistake. Now, proof of that mistake cannot be fully canvassed in an article, let alone a very quick speech, but I want at least to raise a couple of questions. So two of them I want to put on the table. First, is it time for nationalists to reassess what we owe democracy's outliers? Views on what the loyal opposition is owed have evolved over time in other countries. The question is whether our thinking ought to evolve as well. The battles to make the First and 15th Amendment meaningful were hard fought and important. They may not be the end of our democratic journey, however. In the abstract, for example, the opportunity for dissenters to voice their concerns and vote their consciences seems like it ought to be enough. The moment power enters the equation, however, these democratic gestures seem less grand. The iconoclastic dissenter, for instance, is an archetype in constitutional theory, but he exercises the right of an outsider, not an insider. He is licensed to speak truth to power, but not with it. He is able to speak against power's exercise, but he's rarely able to influence it. First Amendment rights are a sign of our tolerance, so we are told by some scholars, and so it is. But is it a sign of our loyalty to an opposition whose loyalty we in turn demand? So too, the right to vote, while profound and important, loses some of its normative oomph when one starts to do the math. The right gives democracy's outliers a chance to exercise a proportionate share of power in governance. That's why diversity, the notion that decision-making bodies ought to mirror the polity from which they are drawn, has become the benchmark for democratic legitimacy. But that benchmark is also a statistical guarantee of the majority's power. The nationalist strategy for minority empowerment thus relentlessly reproduces the same inequalities on every governing institution that minorities experience everywhere else. On the issues that divide us, it consigns minorities to the perpetual status of losers. Now, that may be a tempting option for those in the majority. It ought to be less appealing for those who are not. None of this should be news to the nationalists. After all, rights talk has been shelled by academics of every strike, but most of those challenges have been all in the kill. Scholars have offered a number of telling criticisms, but few have put forward a readily discernible, or at least remotely plausible, solution. So too, the idea of diversity has been dented here and there, but it reigns supreme for a simple reason, that nationalists have not been able to offer a viable alternative to this deeply intuitive vision of democracy. Nationalists, in short, know that we owe our loyal opposition something more. They just can't tell you what that something more is. It's worse than that, though, because nationalists consistently devalue the something more that we do offer our loyal opposition: decentralization. Decentralization offers a robust complement to rights, and minority rule can be as important as minority rights to the project of integration. To be sure, most nationalists are happy to favor federalism for this or that pet issue, typically gay rights or environmental reform, and some of them subscribe to that sort of muddle-headed and deeply naive vision of participation that leads people to like local democracy. But that just means that they are localists for the wrong reasons, and many are inconstant localists at that. Nationalists are not, however, willing to acknowledge that federalism is a robust institutional competitor to rights as a means of achieving political and racial integration. Diversity is not the only touchstone for measuring our success. Now that, of course, would be fine if the nationalists had a better alternative to put on the table, but they don't. It's all too easy to play the role of critic, simultaneously complaining about national rights and national politics while trotting out outdated complaints about federalism. And those who think that decentralization should be understood as a distinctively American vision of loyal opposition can fairly ask the nationalists to put something better on the table. To use the unduly blunt vernacular of the playground, the question is whether it's time for the nationalists to put up or shut up. Now, let me just offer 3 quick definitional points before I get into the main meat of the paper and one Weasley caveat. So first, on a definitional point, although our decentralized system creates space for a loyal opposition to describe, I don't want you to confuse it with your father's federalism, for those of you who come from the US. So first, the system I describe is not confined to states. It is federalism all the way down, which includes sub-state, local, and sub-local institutions. So put in your head the idea of a majority black city council, a town that favors same-sex marriage, a zoning commission dominated by Greens, a jury that contains 9 Latinos instead of 2, a school board controlled by Darwin skeptics. States, after all, are often too large to serve as sites of empowerment for racial minorities and political minorities. But our federalism, properly defined, includes countless sites for minority rule. Political and racial minorities exercise power in governing bodies that lack sovereignty, that may even lack a robust form of autonomy. The power that minorities wield in these institutions is often the power of the servant, the power of the bureaucrat, the power of the agent. It is, in other words, a form of power that we often treat as if it were not power at all. Now, that's a little bit strange about con law. There are entire legal fields, administrative law, corporate law, that are all but devoted to taming the power of the agent. But constitutional law often forgets how powerful the servant can be. A highly decentralized, partially politicized system like our own is all but built for a loyal opposition to thrive. And yet nationalists consistently overlook the power that racial and political minorities wield in our Tocquevillian bureaucracy. Now, our federalism is not your father's federalism in another important respect, and here comes my second definitional point. State sovereignty looms large in the minds of the nationalists when they discuss federalism, with many viewing federalism as a code word for letting racists be racist. But federalism today is largely sheared of federalism's traditional trappings. The sovereignty card that was wielded during the days of slavery and Jim Crow cannot be played anymore. If the national government wants to find a way to regulate, it can find a way to regulate. The national government then can police federalism's worst excesses while taking advantage of its best features, including the benefits that it offers our loyal opposition. And that fact ought to change nationalist calculation as to whether the decentralization game is worth the candle. Federalism may not be perfect in the nationalist eyes, but it is at least more perfectible than it once was. Third, as I said before, the term loyal opposition is a term of art used to describe the ways in which Great Britain and some of its former colonies institutionalized the opposition. So while I'm going to advert to the notion here and there, both in noting that the concept has evolved over time and in emphasizing its institutional dimensions, for the purpose of this paper, I am just using this as a loose interpretive frame, one that captures the democratic notion that those in power ought to show loyalty to the opposition when they demand that opposition's loyalty in return. So here's the weaselly caveat. Let me just say one thing before you all put up your hands and attack me. Nationalists sleep easily at night because they think that the First and 15th Amendments are sufficient to protect and empower racial minorities and dissenters. Why bother with decentralization, which obviously involves costs, if the current system is working just fine? Now, I want to unsettle that easy assumption in this paper by suggesting that we owe more to our loyal opposition. But questioning the sufficiency of rights is not, of course, the same thing as questioning their necessity. So nothing I say today is intended to diminish the luster of the crown jewels of our constitutional democracy. To the contrary, the essay is really premised, and the speech is premised on the notion that rights have laid a strong enough foundation for political and racial integration to take place. The question I want to raise is whether we ought to think harder about what gets built upon that foundation. So let me give you an all too brief account of an all too conventional wisdom. If you want to understand why rights and diversity has become nationalism's intellectual traveling companions, because I think there's nothing that says that they had to in the first place, you have to trace the odd, maybe even perverse relationship between them. For reasons having to do with the ugliness of our history and the attractiveness of the diversity paradigm, most legal scholars and virtually all nationalists have looked to the First and 15th Amendments as the best means of empowering the opposition and earning its loyalty. Now, if rights are the means for achieving racial and political integration, diversity is its measure. Diverse decision-making bodies that mirror the polity from which they are drawn have become the touchstone for democratic legitimacy, the measure of political and racial integration, the sign that the loyal opposition has been treated fairly. All of this places the nationalists in opposition to federalism as either a means of empowering democracy's allies or a baseline for evaluating those efforts. Indeed, even nationalists who think that we owe the loyal opposition something more than rights and diversity reject the notion that decentralization provides that something more. Now, as you know, of course, most of the American Academy is nationalist in its orientation. And it's not just that we mostly study federal law and national institutions. Most academics, most nationalists believe that, all things considered, national institutions are superior to state and local ones. Nobody thinks that everything should be centralized, nor does anyone maintain that everything should be decentralized. But when the inevitable contests come up over devolution, academics generally suit up with the nationalists. Nationalists also subscribe to a common set of tropes when it comes to the project of racial and political integration. They focus on rights, not institutions, in thinking about what we owe democracy's outliers. And that is largely due, I think, to history. It may also stem from the fact that the institutions that we use to accommodate our loyal opposition don't fit neatly into doctrinal silos. They don't emerge seamlessly from our constitutional text, and they bear little connection to our original history. Or maybe it's just that the institutions that empower our loyal opposition just fall within academics' blind spots. Dissenters and racial minorities are, after all, the darlings of most intellectuals. And they are also the objects of constitutional solicitude, with amendments devoted to the fate of each built in. That confluence has led academics to treat rights as the natural tool for promoting racial and political integration and thereby creating a loyal opposition. It's also ensured that diversity has become the measure, the yardstick for measuring whether integration has been achieved. And I just should note, for those of you who are common law experts in the US, by diversity I'm not referring to the thin notion endorsed by Justice Powell and Bakke, but the deeply intuitive notion that the decision-making bodies should mirror the polity from which they are drawn. It's a simple equation for nationalists then. Rights are the means we use to create a loyal opposition, and diversity is the measure of success. Now, the consensus isn't clean, needless to say, but it is robust. While nationalists can gripe about the court's failure to fulfill the promise of the Civil Rights Amendments, they still believe in rights. They just prefer the Warren Court to be vindicating them rather than the Roberts Court watering them down. So too, nationalists routinely complain that the Supreme Court has at times accepted an irritatingly shallow notion of diversity as a rationale for affirmative action, but they don't question the more fundamental ideal that diversity is the touchstone for democratic legitimacy. The democratic bodies ought to mirror the polity from which they're drawn. Now, it's not clear whether constitutional theory is the source of these academic tropes or just mirrors and reinforces them. I assume it's the latter. But you'll notice that something even as basic as the division of labor among scholars serves to buttress these notions while leaving our normative blind spots in place. The worker bees of the Academy have long divvied up the three great projects of American constitutionalism. The first is governance, allocating power among institutions so that policymaking flourishes and a leviathan does not emerge. And these questions have been taken up by those interested in constitutional structure, federalism, the separation of powers. The rest of the work falls to those who labor on the rights side of the Constitution. Devotees of the First Amendment have done yeoman's work on the project of dissent, guaranteeing a healthy amount of debate and disagreement in the democratic sphere. So too, 14th and 15th Amendment gurus have done most of the thinking on the project of racial integration, ensuring that our fractious polity remains a polity, with their First Amendment brethren putting in a laboring oar when it comes to dissenters. Now, that division of labor seems intuitive and it seems obvious, but it's a mistake. It ensures that we focus almost entirely on rights, not governance, when we think deeply about what our democracy owes its minorities. It ensures that the conventional wisdom about diversity's preeminence remains conventional. Now, there are critics, of course, because tropes rarely emerge unscathed in the Academy, and the nationalist tropes about rights and diversity are no exception. But the critics lack much by way of an affirmative agenda. And that may not matter in some fields, but it can be a death knell in a relentlessly pragmatic, problem-oriented field like law. The critique of rights on the one hand and diversity on the other may have taken the sheen off of these democratic icons, but it hasn't knocked them off their pedestal. Now, federalism, of course, is the main competitor to nationalism, but federalism scholars have not been able to undermine the nationalist sense that the conventional wisdom is conventional with good reason. It's not that either side disagrees very much about the anodyne, quasi-bureaucratic justifications for centralization or devolution. Those who favor federalism plainly understand, for instance, that there are economies of scale and regulatory arenas that demand uniformity, both of which favor moving issues up on the decision-making ladder. And nationalists are just as capable of recognizing the values associated with local tailoring and democratic experimentalism. Moreover, I will just say scholars of both stripes seem equally susceptible to the type of amorphous and deeply naive calls for local participation that make sensible people break out in hives. Now, the reason that there are intellectual camps then isn't because we all balance the same well-accepted costs and benefits on the same well-accepted scale and come out with a slightly different result. We'd all be quibbling if that were the case, and our views would fall along a continuum and not be divided into intellectual camps. No, the reason that nationalists are nationalists is that they think the costs of devolution are too high. And most of those costs have to do with the treatment of political and racial minorities, particularly the latter. William Riker wrote that if one disapproves of federalism, if one disapproves of racism, one should disapprove of federalism. Our nationalists tend to be more polite, but the worry is exactly the same. Now, to be fair to the nationalists, I feel like this objection has never really been met by proponents of federalism. Whenever the nationalists invoke slavery or Jim Crow as something of a trump card, federalism's proponents respond with a little bit other than an apologetic sidebar. We're so sorry that federalism caused all this oppression, and then they move on. Similarly, in addressing nationalist worries about dissenters, most federalism proponents have not found any middle ground between the kind of anodyne idea that states should serve as laboratories of democracy and the alarming notion of armed state rebellion. So it's little wonder then that those who pride themselves on being loyal to democracy's outliers are so confident that nationalism's tropes are correct. History has just reinforced the nationalist blind spots, or maybe created them in the first place, because for many, the story of racial progress is the story of Brown. I think for the more discerning, the story of racial progress is the story of the Civil Rights Acts. But in either case, the means for achieving integration and the appropriate measure of integration are clear. The touchstone, nationally enforced rights were the reason we got racial progress, and the touchstone for measuring racial progress is diversity. And by diversity, again, I'm not referring to the viewpoint diversity idea once blessed by the Supreme Court, but that idea that democratic bodies ought to mirror the polity. The despicable legacy of Jim Crow, racial enclaves, runs in fact so deep in the legal imagination that it is inscribed in our vocabulary. We have two ways of classifying institutions in terms of race. We describe them as either diverse, or we describe them as segregated. Diverse institutions mirror the polity. Segregated institutions are those where racial minorities dominate. We don't have a laudatory term for heterogeneous institutions where racial minorities are in the majority and whites are in the minority. Those just get lumped together with segregated institutions. As a result, we have no means of distinguishing between the racially homogeneous enclaves of Jim Crow and heterogeneous institutions where racial minorities wield majority power. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that we do actually have terms for the structures that give racial minorities a chance to rule: federalism and localism. The problem is nationalists equate those ideas with racial oppression, not racial empowerment. Now, the story of dissent is probably more complex and a good deal more variegated, but the bottom line is roughly the same. We are familiar with the role that states and local constitutions have played in facilitating dissent. Kentucky and Virginia's response to the Alien and Sedition Acts are the most prominent examples, but we're all aware of the storied role that juries played in our early history. But the history of dissent and decentralization has hardly been a heroic one, given the tendency of local majorities to persecute dissenters within their own ranks, raising important questions about how to protect minorities within the minority. And here again, Jim Crow supplies the ugliest example. A recalcitrant national minority that controlled power in the southern states ruthlessly persecuted white and black supporters of the civil rights movement. And here again, it was national rights enforced by national actors that protected dissenters. And here again, history has deprived us of the vocabulary to describe the good that can come from majority-minority institutions with regard to dissent. We typically, for example, don't associate states and localities that oppose national views with our storied tradition of dissent. Instead, the terms we have to describe these institutions are negative. We call them lawless, we call them parochial, and we condemn them as such. Now, federalism's ugly history is the most obvious reason for the nationalist confidence in rights and diversity, but it isn't the only one. Because once one focuses on rights rather than structure as a means for securing a loyal opposition, diversity just naturally emerges as the measure of our success, at least in a cautious, judicially oriented regime like ours. Now, it's easy to see the intuitive case for statistical mirroring as a measure for whether we have treated racial minorities fairly. Diverse institutions in our minds are just equated with integrated ones. After all, what better sign is there that the political system is working fairly than the presence of racial minorities in rough proportion to their population? Racial minorities, in the words of the Supreme Court, should not be subject to, quote, political famine, unquote, but neither are they entitled to a political feast. The relationship between political minorities and diversity is also roughly similar. Political minorities and diversity. And here again, diversity seems initially like the right touchstone for measuring fairness. If dissenters are represented in rough proportion to the underlying population, they have every opportunity to persuade the majority to change its views, or at least trade away their votes in exchange for a softer concession here or there. We expect dissenters to be one lone juror among 12 angry men. We don't expect dissenters to wield majority power on a decision-making body. To the contrary, we protect the right to speak in large part because dissenters lack the power to decide. Dissenters are supposed to speak truth to power, but not with it. That's what makes them dissenters. This is also maybe why the right to vote has never been conflated with the right to win. Most think that a fair election system gives everyone a proportionate share of power. But minorities, by definition, must remain in the minority unless and until they win enough votes to their sides. That's precisely why we give them the right to speak and organize and cast a ballot. The rights guaranteed under the Constitution, in short, are rights to participation, not power. Now, if participatory rights are what we owe democracy's outliers, diversity isn't just an intuitive measure of our progress, it's also a workable one. Because we have a crude sense of how power is supposed to work. The group with the most votes is supposed to win. But once one moves past that easy toggle, it's really hard to explain what share of power this or that minority group is supposed to wield. We can identify signs of unfairness, to be sure, but minorities are supposed to lose in a majoritarian system. Now, while it's difficult to measure political power, at least we can measure political presence. And statistical mirroring is as deeply intuitive a measure of presence as one could devise. What better sign that we could ever be held accountable for it? So note, by the way, when it comes to democracy's outliers in governance, our institutional impulses don't go much beyond nose counting. We think a lot about group membership on decision-making bodies, but the work done on group empowerment has largely been confined to private associations, not state actors. We have a vocabulary and grammar for lauding the benefits of diversity for racial minorities and dissenters, but we lack an account of the benefits decentralization affords to democracy's outliers, namely the ability to rule at the state and local level. Instead, we more commonly associate federalism and localism with all those other dreaded isms, racisms, parochialism, cronyism, you name it. Notice, too, what is largely absent from the nationalist account of what we owe democracy's outliers. Nationalists talk a lot about rights, but they don't actually talk a lot about structure. Discussions of power center on the ability of the national government to protect racial minorities and dissenters, not on the power either group wields at the national level. Rights talk focuses on individuals and groups. Rights talk focuses on individuals, not groups. And to the extent that we talk about politics, we see many an ode to participation, but few references to power. Crass notions like winners and losers are largely eschewed. So the question we ought to ask is, do we owe more to democracy's outlier than the national accounts suggest? Are the rights guaranteed by the First and 15th Amendment enough? Before turning to these questions, though, I want to once again acknowledge the obvious. Rights are necessary but not sufficient. That's the basic claim that I'm going to make in this paper. So let's just start with the First Amendment and talk about why rights are necessary but not sufficient. And here I'm just going to give you a cynic's account of the First Amendment. And that's not because it's entirely true, but because I want to make you wonder a little, even worry a little about the First Amendment. At the very least, I'm hoping that it'll make you less dismissive of institutions that complement the work that the First Amendment does. So the First Amendment guarantees the right to speak and associate. Both are requirements for a well-functioning democracy. But you don't actually have to be a cynic to recognize that protest and debate are not always enough. You can make this point by drawing on the long-standing political science literature and agenda setting, but a crude example will do the trick here. Picture in your mind, just for a second, what is the iconic image of a dissenter? It is a person standing up on a soapbox in the park. And now ask yourself a simple question. What do you do when you see the guy on the soapbox in the park? You walk right on by. That is why our dominant model of dissent is the iconoclastic, even crazy, dissenter. Free speech, after all, is a private right. The moment a citizen ceases to speak for himself and begins to speak for the state, his First Amendment rights all but disappear. The right to free speech is the right of an outsider. Even when dissenters are on the inside, our understanding of dissent is built around the ideas that they lack the power to decide. That's what makes them, as I said before, dissenters. Now, viewed from the perspective of institutional relations, dissenters look even less threatening to those who walk on by, to those uninterested in engaging with them. The right to speak freely is just widely accepted now. The most difficult problem for political outliers then isn't getting their message out, it's getting their message across. It's hard enough to get those in power to listen to them, let alone to get those in power to do something. Getting something on the national agenda is the most challenging trick nowadays in politics. There are a lot of people protesting the current state of our financial system, our failure to address climate change, the status of drones, the size of our budget, you name it. There are people on both sides of the political aisle ready to go to the mat over immigration reform, gay rights, entitlement programs, and the like. Now, you might claim today that today's hyperpolarization is to blame for these difficulties, but let's face it, the federal government has not addressed many of these issues for a very long time. Whatever the political climate, national elites are rarely eager to engage with the issues that divide us. The First Amendment then isn't that hard. for people in power. Certainly, there are times when it's deeply challenging at the human level. Allowing despicable groups like the Nazis to march in Skokie or the members of the Westboro Baptist Church to protest at veterans' funeral is difficult for everyone, most especially for those against whom that speech is directed. But in our stable and largely tolerant democracy, those groups are not going to upend the status quo. And given the challenges associated with changing the status quo, neither will most of the people currently exercising the rights that the Constitution confers on them. And that's not surprising. It is hard for those in power to cede power to others. It is far easier to cede them the right to speak up against power's exercise. The First Amendment confers a right to speak up against a decision, but not to change it, not even to influence it. Now, of course, it has to be the case. You might think there can be no right to influence or change the majority's mind. Participation really is all that political outliers can demand. Now, a cynic might see the basic truth of those claims and yet wonder whether the right to speak is just a little bit too convenient for those in power. Because what better way to maintain one's power than let people speak out against the status quo while depriving them of the ability to change it? I'm not suggesting some conspiracy-fueled fantasy that those in power have maintained the First Amendment right for this purpose, but a cynic, upon hearing that free speech confers legitimacy on our political system, will naturally wonder whether that legitimacy is deserved. A cynic might even argue that the mainstream theories that we use to justify and apply the First Amendment largely reflect the majority's interests. Now, maybe that's not surprising, given that the early case law and advocates were there to persuade the majority to accept this right in the first place. Nonetheless, it's hard not to notice how appealing the justifications we traditionally offer for dissent, granting dissenters the right to speak, are pretty easy for a complacent majority. The First Amendment has long, for instance, been thought to create a robust marketplace of ideas, something that, of course, any decision maker would desire. Dissenters play a role, to be sure. If their ideas are good, they may eventually gain a majority of their own. But proponents of the theory are just as happy to have wrong-headed dissenters around, so we can test our arguments and figure out precisely how right we are. So too, the First Amendment is thought to ensure that we have the information we need to govern ourselves. It's another idea that ought to be deeply appealing to the majority, and it's another idea that places dissenters only in a supporting role. And here too, again, our focus on the majority that receives the information, not on the minority that conveys it. Even when we recognize that the First Amendment is sometimes a difficult pill for the majority to swallow, scholars have tempted the majority with claims that the majority shows its toleration toward those who dare question it by protecting their right to speak. And tolerance, of course, is a lovely idea. But it also suggests a set of power relations that would be amenable to a complacent majority, maybe even a self-satisfied one. Now, to the extent that the needs and interests of dissenters are front and center in any of the main theories undergirding the First Amendment, it comes with those that emphasize the First Amendment's expressive dimensions. But these arguments are highly individualistic and often romantic. They are not the stuff of power politics. They are not what matters to cynical political actors trying to get something done. When one views the First Amendment through the lens of power relations, other worries on the literature begin to emerge. Associational rights are understudied, the role of groups is underplayed, and precious little attention is paid to what takes place inside political structures, which means precious little attention is paid to what takes place inside the institutions where power lies. The First Amendment, after all, is all about the road to the State House, but our interest in the fate of dissenters seems to end at the State House door. Now, scholars of dissent are conscious of the First Amendment's shortcomings, and they've offered a variety of proposals about what something more we owe our loyal opposition. Some of those proposals are so politically implausible that I will not canvass them for you. But most of the politically viable proposals have emphasized just changes in the doctrine that would in turn generate more opportunities for speech. Some have called for a more institutional First Amendment that lends greater protection to speech-facilitating institutions like universities, the media, and the like. Others have insisted that we need more public space for dissent. Still others have urged the government to create more public platforms for debate and more space for outlier views. So I'll just note two things about these proposals. First, most rest on the assumption that the best way to remedy the First Amendment's inadequacies is to generate more speech and more platforms for speech, rather than facilitating different forms of advocacy, offering different platforms for mobilizing, and taking advantage of different levers for change. Second, while legal scholars have offered a variety of fixes, none has contemplated the possibility that decentralization might be the institutional solution we need, let alone that it might be the institutional solution that we already have. Now, if we turn to the question of race and the right to vote, a similar story emerges. And I note that some of you might just bristle for a moment at the idea of pairing racial minorities and dissenters in this way. Why would we call minorities part of the loyal opposition? Now, both groups, I think, are properly termed democracy's outliers, which means it's important to think about how we earn their loyalty and show them loyalty in return. But nonetheless, there are obviously substantial differences between political and racial minorities. While the notion of a loyal opposition just works naturally for dissenters, at first glance, it seems like an odd phrase to attach to racial minorities. So if that metaphor doesn't work for you, you can just dismiss it as a rhetorical flourish. And in your mind, every time I use the word loyal opposition, you can just sub in the word integration in the context of race. But let me just push you a little bit on why I think there are reasons to pair the politics of race with the politics of dissent and to put both groups under the rubric of the loyal opposition. To begin, it's worth remembering the simple fact that whites and racial minorities often divide along racial lines in politics. I'm not just referring to racially polarized voting, which exists in many places and is particularly pronounced in some, but the notion of opposition provides a useful reminder that there is genuine disagreement between whites and racial minorities on a variety of issues. And that fact ought to matter in the way we think about how to structure our democracy. So too, while those in the majority might feel uncomfortable classifying racial minorities as part of the opposition, it's worth remembering that racial minorities may well feel opposed, even if they understand themselves not to be in the opposition. In fact, that's one way of thinking about what it means to be discriminated against. If you press even harder on the metaphor, we might even think that the idea of pairing loyalty and opposition is useful for both political minorities and racial minorities. With political minorities, we are well aware that they are in the opposition, but we sometimes doubt their loyalty. With racial minorities, we have few doubts about their loyalty, but we sometimes forget that they are capable of vibrant oppositional politics. On this view, the term opposition can be thought of as something of an honorific. It's a healthy reminder to think of racial minorities not as victims, but as capable political actors. Now, if we are concerned with the proper treatment of the loyal opposition when it comes to racial minorities, it's not hard to see the shortcomings of the right to vote, at least when diversity is a touchstone for democratic fairness. Because if all we get at the end of the day is diverse decision-making bodies, ensuring that racial minorities enjoy a share of seats on decision-making bodies that is proportional to their share of the population, that's not ultimately going to provide racial minorities with a great deal of power. As I said before, decision-making bodies that are diverse are often depicted as the epitome of racial empowerment, as a measure of successful racial integration. But if you look through the lens of power relations, you realize that diversity ensures that racial minorities are submerged, that the same numeric inequalities that exist in the population exist on decision-making bodies as well. It means that racial minorities will be the regular loser for any issue on which race divides us along racial lines. It means that they will never have the opportunity to wield the power that whites unthinkingly wield. You don't have to be a cynic to think that that's an odd theory of empowerment. Diversity, in short, is a measure of racial integration that involves a relatively anemic vision of racial power. It's one where racial minorities never get the chance to stand in the shoes of the majority. It's one where the tables are never turned on the majority, where whites never risk defeat on issues where we divide along racial lines. And that fact alone ought to give us pause. Nor does the Dahlian account provide a ready answer to these concerns. Dahl famously argued that minorities rule in a democracy with shifting coalitions of minorities wielding majority power over time. But of course, the nationalists worry about racial minorities precisely because they are not full partners in a Dahlian coalition. Now, scholars of equality have long worried about the danger of submergence, and as with dissenters, they've also proposed a variety of remedies for the perceived inadequacies of the rights diversity framework. Some have emphasized the importance of a critical mass of racial minorities on a decision-making body, but thus far that hasn't pushed anyone past statistical mirroring. Some have proposed decision-making rules like taking turns or unanimity rules that force members of the majority to pay attention to the interests of racial minorities. But the uptake, I will just say, on these proposals has been slow. Other scholars have gone farther, urging the creation of private safe spaces or private associations for racial minorities, which is all well and good, but safe spaces are also separate spaces, which means that they risk conveying the message that racial minorities require protection from the rough and tumble of politics. Outside of the United States, others have argued that we should give certain minorities territorially defined enclaves protected by sovereignty, guaranteed representation, and the like. In casting about for solutions, however, scholars of equality have not looked to our federalism, the state, sub-state, and sub-local institutions where racial minorities are in the majority as sites of racial empowerment. So let me turn to the last question. Do we owe our loyal opposition something more? I don't think any of this should be actually news to the nationalists. Even if academics weren't all but allergic to being in favor of something, the defects of the rights paradigm are well known, and so too, I think nationalists would readily concede when pressed that diversity is at best an imperfect touchstone for democratic fairness given the way power works. Nationalists, in short, are aware of the inadequacy, the means by which we build a loyal opposition and the measure by which we judge our success. But if rights and diversity aren't enough, if we owe our loyal opposition something more, it's fair to ask the nationalists what that something more is. Academics always love to play Mary Hume of the famous Shel Silverstein poem. Remember the little girl that always said, almost perfect, but not quite? So they like to show their sophistication by finding fault in all things. But whether or not it is logically tenable to reject the two options on the table, I think it's intellectually cowardly, at least if you don't have anything better to offer in the first place. For that reasons, I think it is fair to say to the nationalists that it's not fair to consistently ignore the possibility of federalism providing us something more unless they can give us something more, or at least they shouldn't reject it outright. And they shouldn't reject it on the very grounds that ought to make them appreciate it, which is the role that federalism plays in ensuring that our loyal opposition remains loyal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are the ways in which the federalism allows our loyal opposition to create a loyal, how federalism allows us to create a loyal opposition. And I don't want to try to convince you that federalism is perfect or even perfectible. I just want to show you that the best candidate we have for something more is federalism. And by best, what I mean is that federalism comes closest to hitting that sweet spot where normative attractiveness and practical seriousness meets. I want to place special emphasis on practicality here. If you think that the solution to what ails our democracy is for the United States to wake up tomorrow and start radically redistributing wealth or politicking in a genuinely deliberative fashion, then you can just stop listening right now. Now, if we want to secure a loyal opposition, we have to focus on two closely related tasks. First, how do we create sufficient space for oppositional politics to earn the opposition's loyalty? And second, given that loyalty is a two-way street, how do we show our respect for the opposition whose loyalty we in turn demand? So let's just start a little bit with dissenters and the way that federalism creates space for oppositional politics. Sometimes, though, the First Amendment, of course, does that too. But as I said before, it might be possible that in some instances the First Amendment is not going to be enough. Federalism provides a great complement to the First Amendment. So think, for example, about some of the things that federalism does for dissenters that the First Amendment can't do. One of the things that federalism does for dissenters, it lends maybe greater visibility, but at least a different form of visibility to dissenters' views, precisely because it provides different platforms for lobbying and different forms of advocacy. The reason that federalism matters to dissenters is it gives them a chance to offer a real-life instantiation of their idea. So think, for instance, about how visible dissent is when it's challenged through the First Amendment alone. Dissenters can publicize their views. Many, to be sure, many actually think that the dramatic proliferation of media forms has only made dissenters' efforts easier in this regard, and surely that is sometimes true. But the proliferation of information sources also creates the risk that dissent will be swamped by the many other media sites competing for our attention. For every Wendy Davis standing up in Texas in her pink shoes, there are thousands of protesters who cannot find a way onto our screens. For this reason, the more of the same remedy that most First Amendment scholars offer may just be counterproductive. Pushing more blogs or more editorials or more YouTube videos into the mix might not make a difference. It might even make things worse. But when political outliers can dissent by deciding, when they can embed their views into a governance decision, they are engaging in a quite different form of advocacy than speech or protest. The platform alone matters. Decisions made by states and local governments on average get more publicity than protests or blogs or editorials. Journalists report on them, for one thing. The decision matters for another. Think, for instance, about the sea change that occurred on the same-sex marriage debate when Massachusetts and San Francisco began issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Supporters of same-sex marriage had spent years writing editorials, marching in parades, debating with their neighbors. The movement, though, received a much-needed boost when state and local government put those ideas into practice. Consider immigration reform, another perennial subject of debate. Now think about what has moved that debate from the editorial pages to the front page. engage. Arizona's anti-immigrant initiative. You can play the same game with dozens of topics. Those who worried once about voting fraud are now able to garner a lot more attention because state legislators are passing voter ID laws. The debate over healthcare was given a lift when Massachusetts put Obamacare's predecessor into place. What mattered in these examples was not that we had more speech. What matters in these examples is that we had advocacy that was run through a different platform and took a different form. Even when reporters are not paying attention to what localities and states are doing, political elites often are. That's why decentralization usefully complements the First Amendment in a second important way. It facilitates agenda setting. When one group or another dissents by deciding, the majority can't just ignore dissenters. It can't walk on by those folks standing on the soapbox. The majority has to do something to get the policy overturned. Decentralization thus gives dissenters a chance to shift the burden of inertia in the policymaking sphere and thereby force the majority to engage. The advantages of decentralization go beyond making dissent visible or setting the agenda. It gives dissenters a chance to move from the abstract to the concrete. They are no longer confined to talking about how this or that policy might work. They can show how it actually works in practice. They show that it can actually work in practice. Decentralization also allows dissenters to build their case for change one step at a time. It's incredibly hard to build a national movement. That's why virtually every national movement began as a local one. Gay rights, civil rights, gun rights, they all began small and turned into something bigger. Social movements have long used state and local policy and policymaking as an organizing tool, a rallying cry, a testing ground for their ideas. And these state and local platforms weren't just a site for early mobilization efforts, they also helped connect dissenters to large and powerful policymaking networks that fuel a great deal of politics and governance in the United States. Decentralization, in short, dramatically expands the sites of resistance and the leverage points for change. In our highly decentralized and partially politicized bureaucracy, dissenters are able to help make national policy. They're able to help make state policy. They do so directly when they serve on juries, sit on locally oriented school boards and zoning commissions. They do so indirectly by electing state and local politicians who serve as nominally bureaucratic roles in implementing federal law. So just focus for a moment on that giant creature we call the fourth estate, the administrative system. The federal administrative system is the most powerful and probably the most important organization we have in this country. The only way to ensure that dissenters are part of that is to have states and localities administering federal law. So I will talk a little bit more about this if you want in the Q&A, but I'll just also note that even if you don't care about the sort of more instrumental justifications for dissenters, we might actually value federalism just because of the respect that it shows dissenters, which is a far less instrumental idea, but nonetheless important. It has expressive significance. Because federalism doesn't just build loyalty by creating space for opposition, it also gives those in power an opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to those whose loyalty they demand. The First Amendment, of course, cloaks political outliers in the grand tradition of dissent, but tradition leaves plenty of room for the self-satisfied aside. We tend to follow the aphorism that's often attributed to Voltaire when speaking of dissenters. I disapprove of what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. But underlying that phrase can be a sentiment closer to the catchphrase that has often been misattributed to Oscar Wilde. I may not agree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to make an ass of yourself. Or at the very least, I think our fondness for Voltaire's formulation bears the whiff of another sentiment, sometimes directed at outliers. Hate the sin, love the sinner. But decentralization is different. Decentralization allows those in power to express their loyalty in a different fashion. The most obvious is that it allows us to respect the choices the dissenters made by allowing them to make the choice in the first place. The First Amendment shows dissenters loyalty by granting them a chance not just to speak against the polity, but to speak for the polity. California implemented federal law when it heavily regulated carbon emissions. Michigan and Wisconsin did the same when they enacted welfare to work. Arizona may have been engaged in what some might call over-cooperative federalism when it passed its controversial immigration law, but it was using federal law as a touchstone. Massachusetts' transformative healthcare regulations, which plainly set the stage for national debate, were carried out under Medicaid. In other words, all of these institutions were where we were letting dissenters speak for all of us, and I think that's an important show of respect. There are other ways that decentralization allows us to show respect for political outliers. The First Amendment confines dissenters to the role of the gadfly, or at least the junior partner on any decision. Decentralization turns the tables, giving those in the majority the chance to do what members of the majority routinely do: win, control the decision, forge coalitions, spearhead a compromise, deal with gadflies of their own, enjoy the sense of efficacy and discomfort associated with governance, tap into the powerful networks that drive the policymaking process. Now, it's not a perfect solution. In fact, I think in many ways, the First Amendment and decentralization are nice complements for one another. They compensate for each other's weaknesses, and they are always working together with one another. But I'll just close by just saying a few words on what I think decentralization does for racial minorities. And again, here I'm happy to talk a great deal more. As I said before, the one worry I have about the right to vote and diversity is that it tends to submerge the minority vote. And as an election law scholar, I think of this as the most natural way to think about power politics. And I was always a little confused when I moved into constitutional law and discovered that no one thought about submergence of racial minorities. Federalism, though, does a lot to compensate for some of what I think of the failings of the diversity paradigm. And here I'll just give you, by way of contrast, just think for a moment about the politics of recognition. The politics of recognition tells us that we grant racial minorities the dignity to be part of the decision-making process. We give them the opportunity to have voice. We give them a chance to have a chance to influence the decision-making process, and that's all well and good. But if you think about what federalism does for racial minorities, it gives them a chance to opportunity to exercise majority power in all kinds of parts of the system. In place of the dignity of voice, we have the dignity of decisions. In place of the power of the politics of presence, we have the politics of power. So again, there's lots of ways I think in which federalism provides a useful counterpart. I'll also just say that if you look at the history of white ethnics and their integration into our polity, it actually suggests to you that federalism is a tool of integration in a robust and kind of ugly sense, but an effective one. So just for a moment, think about how it is that white ethnics were integrated into our system. It happened in places like Boston with Irish and Italians. It happened in places like Chicago with Lithuanians and Poles. And what happened in those systems? Power politics, a giant political machine. What did the machine do? It traded economic opportunity for political votes. It pulled all of these outsiders into the system through a corrupt process that involved graft, power politics, and a great deal of patronage. And what happened? These groups became integrated into the system. At some point, they were no longer Italian and Irish. They were Democrats and part of the project of politics. I actually probably am one of the few scholars who's willing to defend political graft as a form of integration. And I want to defend it not because I think it's particularly attractive as a whole, but I just say if it's been allowed for everyone else, I'd like to see it allowed for racial minorities as well. So just to give you some examples, there are scholars who think that in fact the real drivers of racial integration on the economic front have not been Title VII or the rights under the Constitution. They've been city employment. They've been municipal graft. They've been minority set-asides. All of the things that we sort of get a little bit uncomfortable with as liberals, but those are often the tools. You know, black employment rates are higher in cities with black mayors at the top. Just think about that for a minute. That's a tradition in American politics. But just note the differential way that we treat those traditions. With regard to ethnic majorities, this has happened forever, and we've never said a word about it. Instead, we always bless these things as if they were just part of, rational basis review and interest-based bargaining. But note what the Supreme Court does every time it gets one of these cases, whether it's Croson or our own city of New Haven and Ricci. Whenever they see racial minorities exercising the same kind of power, they suddenly say that this is a problem under the 14th or 15th Amendment. And I should just say it's not just the conservatives that do it. The liberals always call majority-minority districts the politics of the second best. And I don't actually think majority-minority districts are the politics of the second best. I think that they're simply politics. Note also the benefits that are expressive when you allow racial minorities to enjoy majority power. There's an opportunity for turning the table. There's an opportunity where whites essentially agree to experience what all losers in the political system experience, which is a good thumping. It allows racial minorities a chance to control the agenda, to pull, haul, and trade like any other group. There are a number of different ways in which racial minorities benefit from federalism, and I think it's time for federalism to pay more attention to that. So I will just simply close with a simple observation, although I'm basically addicted to this stuff. And so I'm happy to talk about it in any way. But the one last thing I would just say to the nationalists is that it may not be that federalism is perfect. I'm willing to see that immediately. It is imperfect, but it is more perfectible than it used to be. And that's because sovereignty no longer looms large in federalism, which means that nationalists have an opportunity, really, to perfect federalism, to pick and choose among democracy's outliers, to choose who they think are loyal and empower them, and choose who they think are disloyal and not empower them. So loyal opposition, as I said, is a term of art, but I think it does provide a loose interpretive frame for thinking about some of the deepest questions in constitutional theory. And when you view constitutional theory through this lens, the nationalist standbys for protect and empower democracy's outliers, which are rights and diversity, start to seem inadequate for reasons with which we are all familiar. And what I want to put forward to you today is that maybe, just maybe, federalism, which has long been viewed by the nationalists as a mistake, is actually the something more that we owe our loyal opposition. Thank you very much. So I think I'm supposed to, what do I do now? Open it to questions. I'm very obedient. Go ahead.
So I was curious about, it seems like there are a lot of virtues to identifying the talk about the attractiveness of dissenting by deciding as opposed to dissenting by talk, as it were. And I like the device of the person on the soapbox, but I think it also, when you think about dissenting by deciding, I start to be concerned about a problem that you don't get into in the talk, which is that where you let the person on the soapbox not only talk, but now decide, which seems to be what's being advocated, then there's a challenge of what we want to say about the person on the soapbox, as it were, now being able to impose norms on others. And I wanted to invite you to say something in particular here about, so one thing that might strike some people as a counterexample to letting people dissent not only by talk, but by decision is, think about the Senate. So it's one thing if Ted Cruz can like stand up on a soapbox in Texas and talk, but it's another thing if, as it were, through dissenting by decision, it does seem to me like some of the current, maybe not current, but up until a month ago, Senate processes were very friendly to a certain kind of really strong dissent by decision. But it doesn't really strike me as attractive it strikes me as really attractive for Ted Cruz to be able to talk about his vision of government, but profoundly unattractive for him to be able to dissent by deciding by threatening to shut the government down. And I guess I wonder what you sort of gesture at saying that the national government will find ways to regulate, it will find ways to get done what it needs to get done, but to say more about how we can stop dissent by decision from sort of gumming up the works in the way that seems like it's been happening in the Senate.
Okay, that's a good question. Do I need to repeat the question so they can hear it or is the sound good enough? It's good, okay. So I won't repeat the question, although I will say if I had to formulate it in one way, what about the crazies? I have more affection for the crazies in the world probably than the average academic scholar, but it's a routine question, so I'll say just a couple of things about it. And this is in some ways, this speech is in some ways a synthesis of work I've been doing for a long time, so there's a lot of shorthand, so let me know when I go too far. So I'll say two things about the crazies. The first is that unlike my federalism counterparts, and this is where I'm just, I don't belong in either tribe. I'm a nationalist who believes in federalism. I'm a federalist person who writes about federalism who doesn't really care that much about states. I care about their relationship to national power. I have no problem, none at all, with the national government playing the national supremacy trump card. I think, in fact, that's perfectly legitimate. So on the first piece of it, it's perfectly fine with me for the national government to tell dissenters that they can't do something. It is perfectly fine for me for them to whomp them the moment that they step out of line. So unlike federalism scholars who have a problem because they insist on sovereignty or de facto autonomy, they're not allowed to make the kind of distinctions that I freely make because they don't believe in that. Now, so the second question, though, is so how crazy do we allow people to be? I am not advocating that we should let the Michigan militia take its turn with its finger on the nuclear button. So I think it's perfectly, again, fine for the national majority to decide that there are just some things it's not going to authorize local bodies to do. So that leads to a variety of questions about it. So the existence of decentralization still obviously allows them to do it under certain circumstances. And in some ways, I would describe there are three kinds of worries we might have. So there's the worry about what happens when dissenters are doing something that we are authorizing them to do, but they get the bit in their teeth And they go farther than we expected. So Michigan and Wisconsin welfare to work is a perfect example. They were given waivers under federal law to administer welfare. They administered it in a way that's completely contrary to the existing national system, and they eventually toppled it. I think that's perfectly legitimate. They were authorized to do it. It was they were working within the law. That's perfectly fine. And if the national government wanted to change the rules, it could have changed the rules at any moment during that process. The second one is what happens when dissenters just find a gap and they figure out they can do something, even though the national government actually it wasn't like they were authorizing them to experiment. They just find a gap and they do it. Here again, I think that's legitimate for dissenters to do under certain circumstances, but they are limited circumstances, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think those are. Then the third is what about just civil disobedience? So when dissenters are in place, sometimes they engage in civil disobedience. I'll just say frankly, I think San Francisco was engaged in civil disobedience when it started issuing same-sex marriage license, because I do not think that at the moment that they made their decision that it was an interpretation of what existing constitutional law mandated. So I would classify that as civil disobedience, which raises a variety of questions that we are all familiar with about when it is appropriate to engage in civil disobedience and when it's not. For the last two, so how should dissenters think about it? The one thing that I think that's so useful about the idea of a loyal opposition is because if we have a loyal opposition, we also can demand their loyalty, and I think there are terms to the loyal opposition's loyalty. I think it is perfectly fine for the dissenters to use the power that they have to tee up national debates, to within the system that they're existing, accepting the sort of the basic premises of the system, try to move it in one direction or another. The healthcare debate, welfare to work, these are all, the California environmental regulations, these are all examples where they're running against the national consensus, but they're accepting the basic premises of the system. They're just trying to move it in different directions based on a good faith belief of what ought to be achieved. I think that's fine. Dissenters are not, however, in my view, authorized to do what the Deep South did in the wake of Brown v. Board, which is death by 1,000 cuts. That is, once the national consensus has emerged, as it did, I think, during the civil rights period, then they're not allowed to resist it forever and ever. They have to, to use Bruce Ackerman's formulation, there's a difference between a decision and a decision. When the national majority reaches a decision, I think a loyal opposition knows that it ought not be recalcitrant and just oppose something for the sake of opposing it. So I think it's perfectly fine to accept that. And I actually think that is, in fact, the role of politics. Not the role of the crazy politics on both sides, but the parties understand that. We have one party that is struggling with that question right now, but at the end of the day, hardened people in party politics understand that there's a difference between a decision and a decision. The one last thing I'll just say is I actually think for the crazies of the world, the people who are really outliers, that being part of the governance process is an incredibly useful thing for the majority. So here, let me just give you the cynical account. Just think about the Christian right, for example. The story of the Christian right, I think, is a noble story. It is a story of a bunch of people who suited up and they got in the game. So the thing I think progressives really don't always like to politic and work for their position, but it's deeply admirable that the Christian right got up, suited up, got in the game, took over a bunch of school boards, and tried to put their ideas into place. And they failed one after another. They tried for religion in the schools, that got thumped down. They tried for school prayer, and that got them down. They tried school prayer at graduation, and that got knocked down. They tried for moments of silence, right? One after another. They kept trying to pour their ideas into a narrow and narrow policy-making space. What happened over time? Two things. So first, they moderated their demands significantly. If you now look at what the right wants in these debates, they don't want to teach the creation story. They want to teach the controversy. That means that they've been paying attention to this kind of iterative, Reva Siegel writes about this beautifully, this iterative process by which we move into a sort of closer to one another. That happened, and I think it happened in part because they were part of the governance process, that they received a routine thumping from the national government when they went too far. But over time, they've moved into a position that's a little bit harder for liberals to disagree with. What's wrong with teaching the controversy, right? But the second thing is they're actually robustly integrated into the political process in a way that they were not in the 1960s and 1970s. So they've suited up, they got in the game, and now they're players. And that's exactly what we want from dissenters. You may not like their politics, but on the other hand, having them as a robust part of the political process is important. It is better than having them outside the system, like the Michigan militia. And I think that's actually a natural feature of what I call dissenting by deciding, which is this iterative process over time by which people pouring their ideas into narrow policymaking spaces eventually learn how to do the things we want everyone to learn to do. Engage in compromise, be part of the game, learn what it means to be part of a loyal opposition. So I agree that there are costs to it. I don't want to deny them at all. But I also think that the benefits are substantial and that we have means of controlling the costs in our federalism that conventional federalism scholars basically ignore.
I like the idea of using federalism to promote majority minority districts and all that. I'm wondering from just a policy perspective, what are sort of simple policy things that can be done to try and do that? Second, I was wondering if there's sort of a danger if you devolve power down that you might promote self-segregation over time into different sort of, majority minority enclaves and then different enclaves. And then third, to the extent that money is correlated with, being in the majority, you might end up with sort of rich majority enclaves and poor minority enclaves.
Yeah.
How and would a sort of devolved system deal with sort of income inequality and transfer of wealth?
Yeah. So on the first question of how do you do more of it, so there are, this is going to get boring, so I'll just say there are a variety of ways to do it. Just in terms of institutional design, the two main movers that we have are one, random assignment. That's how we get what I call second order diversity among juries. Because if you weirdly, the whole idea of the jury is premised on the idea that it should mirror the community, and yet we design it in such a way that it can't mirror the community. Because anytime you have a random draw, you're going to get a spread of decision-making bodies. The other way that we do it is districting. And it's sort of amazing how much districting we do. We district jural districts, right? We district school districts. So you can always, in a self-conscious way, as an institutional designer, think about these values. On the second question, will this create incentives to self-segregate? So my guess is no, and for the following reason, because it's as powerful a tool as this is for dissenters writ large, and it's something that happens by happenstance, right? You won't always be on the decision-making body at the right time with the right question. This is why the First Amendment's useful, because it's always there for dissenters, whereas the opportunity to dissent by deciding doesn't always come up. It's hard for me to imagine. I love politics. I'm not sure if I would base my decision about where I move on thinking about that kind of question. So other than schools, where people are not doing it because they want to engage in dissent, but because they have a certain view about what kind of school system they want, and taxes, I think that those are the real drivers, and that agglomeration economics is the real driver, and jobs are the drivers. So I think that these things are so swamped by the everyday concerns of normal people that it's not going to cause us to self-segregate more. There's plenty of self-segregation already, but that self-segregation I think is happening mostly because of our natural tribal instincts more than anything else. The third question is a really good example of this is not this I didn't say, but I'll just say for now. When I make these arguments, and I always give you the kind of sunny side of Sears, I always give you the positive. The reason is I actually think that you can't really make this decision for everything. So that you can't just say, okay, now for all of these questions, devolution more, devolution. I think it actually really does depend on the issue and the nature of the groups involved and the particular question and the costs and benefits of variation, which are going to vary tremendously from institution to institution. So I generally don't answer this question in the abstract. But I will say on the wealth disparity front, I think that as a general matter, school funding is a perfect example, taxes are another example that is bad. That's better for that decision to go up. Not because I think that, I do actually think it's good for localities to enjoy local pots of money. I just want them to be distributed more equitably. So I'm happy to give decision makers decision-making authority over how to distribute the pots. But when the division for where the money gets plunked down in the first place, I'd like that to happen higher up. And I think that's perfectly fine I think that you don't have to be all decentralization or all nationalism on it. No one thinks that. So I think that's one of the good moves that you can make.
So just kind of a follow-up. For non-geographically concentrated minorities, is there something more than rights that you think you can give them? Or is there also institutional design mechanisms?
Yeah.
Non-geographical?
No, so it's a really good question. So it's the central question in voting. So what about groups that aren't sufficiently self-segregated? Asians is the example in voting. So African Americans are pretty concentrated, easy to empower using districts. Latinos are less easy because they tend to move in a less concentrated way. But Asian Americans, except for places like California, they're just not concentrated enough to do it. So it's a perennial problem. I don't have a solution to that problem, except to say something like this. In election law and democratic theory, we commonly use the idea of the idea that you're represented even by someone you didn't vote for, so you're just virtually represented. In some ways, I sort of imagine federalism as a system of virtual representation. So it may be that that on a variety of issues, I am not represented by New Haven, or you might be the person living in Austin, where Texas is really not so much your cup of tea. But on the other hand, there's crazy Massachusetts and doing stuff for you, and so you're virtually represented by the people who share your political views in Massachusetts. And I think the same can be said that there's a lot of virtual representation. So just when California started marrying same-sex couples, I felt like it was actually in some ways representing a lot of people across the country, even those who didn't fly out to get married. And I think that that's as good as it's going to get. So I don't have a solution to the problem, but I do think that I have the same answer that other people have about this question.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say I'm pretty much convinced with your idea, but I wonder if you can elaborate on 2 points. First of all, I wonder about internal minorities. In the community of dissenters, they seem to be more vulnerable than they currently are. And the second question is I have in mind Michael Walter's notion of spheres of justice, and I wonder, when you talk about federalism, is it only geographic federalism, or should we also go to federalism according to substance and sort of questions of
like postcard districts or something. Yeah. So in the first question, I also worry about minorities within a minority, and I think you should. The one thing I will say is that since I imagine a system with a rights baseline, my system got some built-in protections for minorities with minorities, and also since I think the national government can intervene when it wants to. So I think it's perfectly fine for the nationalists to say, I'm sorry, Jim Crow South, we're gonna step in and protect the minorities within your minority, and that's perfectly acceptable. It's not a full solution, right? Because unlike the rights analogy, where it's just participation and you're just speaking, you actually have power that you can exercise over people, and so there are dangers of abuses. The jury system is the perfect example, right? So the worry about the certain kinds of juries engaged in putting people behind bars because they're dissenting, that's ugly, and I think you should have built-in protections for it. So I don't have a perfect solution to it. On the other hand, I don't actually think the other side does either. So that's the. I have rights; they have rights. So that's about as far as there is no perfect solution to this problem. I also think it depends on what time of the world you're in. I would not make this argument in the 1960s. I think we've evolved to a point where the world looks really different than it did before, and that we are a sufficiently robust democracy for decentralization to be used in this way. But that hasn't been true always, so I just want to say that it really depends on where your democracy is. And wait, what was the second question?
Whether it should only be geographical federalism or substance matters.
Yeah, so this is, I guess this is where I'm just going to reveal that I'm a lawyer. So it's not that in theory I can't imagine doing postcard districts or a variety of other means of doing it. I guess I find myself more interested in what is. And sort of what I think is realistic, and I think that just isn't yet where we are. So I wouldn't object to it in any way, but I just sort of I'm more interested in the essentially the politics of happenstance, in looking at the institutions we have and trying to provide a normative account for the way that they work. And that doesn't mean that I would disagree with arguments for pushing it in one direction or another. It's just that that's not really been my area of study, especially given that for the first time ever I've just been. This is really an obnoxious paper in which I basically tell a good percentage of my colleagues that they've been spending a lot of time working on stuff that really does not matter at all, and I'm mocking them a good deal. Just think about the sentence I use for those of you who believe in massive wealth redistribution or deliberate democracy is going to be our savior. I've had that conversation with many of my colleagues at lunch, and now I'm saying to them, forget it. So I'm more interested in the kind of more pragmatic pieces of it, but that doesn't mean that the theoretical ones aren't fine too.
Thank you. Actually, my question goes to Danny's kind of question. Listening to this, I was wondering to what extent it is actually a constitutional argument or more of a general theory of governance, which actually could apply every time we have a multi-tiered kind of structure. And it could be within a state, and it could be at an international level. So to what degree will we actually see this now with sort of international regimes spurring up regional regimes, think EU, or even climate policy?
Yeah, no, so I'll say two things. In some ways, it is not specifically a constitutional argument because it is mostly disembodied from the text. And to some extent, it's disembodied from our original, it's disconnected from our original history as well. That being said, it is actually, I think, the way constitutional law lawyers and law professors talk about the Constitution, because if you don't have an overarching account of how the state federal system works, you can't actually decide all the questions along the way. So I have a different set of arguments about commandeering and preemption, and so there are all these bread and butter questions, doctrinal questions that arise under sort of straightforward constitutional law, I think are connected to these broader theories, and I think that there are actually two camps, and that I want to bring the camps together, and I want to sort of suggest to the nationalists they ought to be thinking about these questions differently, which in turn leads to a bunch of different doctrinal moves under sort of mainstream con law. So we're all institutionalists now, and this is sort of the way that we talk about these questions. And then the second question.
I was just wondering to what extent it's more general good it could be.
Oh, yes, yeah.
International law.
It really can. So especially Gordon was talking about, I'm now doing a bunch of stuff on horizontal federalism, which looks even more like international law, right? Because there's no national referee that would have. I'm talking about interstate conflict, and so yes, it looks a lot like it. I never know how much to say about that fact. Partially because I think you should neither do comparative law nor international law without a license, because I think people make easy mistakes when they do that, or they end up just being so superficial that it makes their colleagues' skin crawl. So I don't say a ton about it in my work. I recognize it's there because I do have some peripheral vision, but I've never really dug into it that much. I think it's true. I mean, I think that I just think federalism is decentralization. There's been for those of you who are familiar, there's this long debate with these two guys named Malcolm and Feeney, who basically said American federalism isn't federalism, and the reason it isn't federalism is because it doesn't look like a formal definition of federalism that is so narrow it applies to almost no one in the world. And I think that's a foolish debate, and a debate that is beside the point. So when I talk about our federalism, I'm basically talking about decentralization, and most places in the world are more or less decentralized than we are, but you can still see all of these arguments, I think, run naturally through them, even though they're run with different groups and different institutions.
I was just wondering, there are still heavy limitations on garnering power in the first place, so you either need to play on the national field and then have, we have a Massachusetts that does that, or have money as the church groups have. So you still have, you still need to have something, and you were saying, well, First Amendment is not enough, so you have to have another, I think maybe platform in order to reach the playing level at federalism. What do you suggest?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think I do. My arguments suffer from the same basic flaw that everyone else does, which is that you have to be a little powerful to get power, and that there has to be some organizing and some amount of numbers and some ability to get your message out at the beginning. Otherwise, this matters not at all. I mean, it's actually true. I mean, for those of you who do con law, it's actually true on the right side as well. So there's this great debate where there's a question about what groups are entitled to protection, and where Marshall basically makes this point, is that unless you get somewhat powerful, no one's ever going to acknowledge you as a rights holder and recognize you as entitled to equality. So that it's a sort of central problem embedded in politics. I don't have a solution to it, but I think nobody else does either. But the one thing I will just say about federalism, and which I mean really federalism all the way down, is that it is an equalizer of sorts, and so in a couple of different ways. So while it is true that money helps everybody organizing, it's just much easier to organize at the smaller level, and you can federalism and localism provide these opportunities for backdoor national policy making. So just think about the same-sex marriage debate. You actually don't have to be at the national level. You just have to win San Francisco's election, right? I mean, the reason why we had same-sex marriage in California is that the mayor almost lost to the Green candidate, which only in San Francisco is there a close race between the Democrats and the Greens. means. Everywhere else, that's not the debate. And so he was, trying to build up his progressive credentials, I think, and because of that. But all you had to do was put pressure on him. It's much easier or look at Romer versus Evans. So in Colorado, the movement for gay equality was being moved through for Boulder and Denver, these cities that were easier to organize at a small level than it was at the statewide level where they got whomped. So I think it's a little bit of an equalizer. Or just think about environmental reform. Like, environmentalists just don't have enough sway to get the national government to start moving on a variety of issues, but they can get California too, even though California is pretty big, but there's enough sympathetic people there. So I don't think it's a perfect solution, but I do think it is an equalizer of sort, particularly for the groups that aren't part of the governing national coalition, right? So there's a lot of groups that just can't get one of their issues on the table because neither party wants to put it into their mix of reasons, and that's really where they just can't break into it. They don't, whatever it is, money or the controversy or whatever, but they can break into it at the local level. And so that's why I think a lot of the movement on immigration and other issues happens at the local level, because it's an equalizer of sort.
So I also find it really persuasive that localism offers an opportunity for loyal opposition, but maybe I'm lacking imagination, because in terms of creating space and respect for oppressed minorities, isn't the means of doing this still procedural rights? And in terms of like redistricting or any of these, and maybe I just need more elaboration on the how we're going to do this. And it seems like creating that respect in that space is a project of procedural rights, right?
Oh, I see, because all governance is processed at some level.
Sure.
Yeah. I speak really quickly, and I was moving through a speech that it turns out was about twice as long as it should have been. I don't know if you saw me moving the pages. So maybe I should just, in case I didn't say this correctly, I think of the rights as participatory rights. So procedure is a bigger category than participation. So yes, to that extent, although I will just say there is no right for most groups other than racial minorities to have a district of their own. So I do think that there is no guarantee right now, other than just sensible institutional design that would make you district in the way that I instruct. But there's also, what I think about this project is that there's a bigger project behind it, which is to try to actually take the idea, like the grand tradition of dissent, and wrap it around my guys. Because I think we do actually mostly condemn localities as lawless and parochial and all these, incompetent and everything else. We don't really see them that respect, that we at least think we ought to see them if they were self-consciously engaged in dissent. Let me just give you, what would it mean if this were normalized? So right now, we have a normalized account of what rights do. Everyone understands that rights are part of pushing equality. But we don't have that idea on the federalism side. So if you guys read Windsor, so Windsor's kind of a confusing opinion. But it's amazing to look at the debate that has happened in the wake of Windsor. So in the wake of Windsor, half the people say, no, it's about rights and equality. And the other people have to say, no, it's about federalism. And it's like, well, it's about both. And it's this idea that these things are two separate worlds. It's either about federalism or it's about rights that lead us to, federalism has not been normalized. I think I just read federalism Windsor as a straightforward federalism opinion and an equality opinion. That's not how it's being read. And the reason I read it that way is because in my mind, I've normalized federalism as a tool of integration and a tool for promoting equality. So that's what, normatively, I would like to see that world. Normatively, I'd like to see a world where the Supreme Court doesn't, every time it sees, in Croson, a majority black city council, it says that its decision to create a minority set-aside is more suspect, whereas when they have ophthalmologists or optometrists engage in egregious interest-based bargaining, they see that as normal politics. Or they see the Vermont farmers getting their dairy subsidies as normal politics. I don't care which the one they choose. They can hate them all, or they can love them all, but I want them to be treated as the same, that is, as normal politics. So I want the people who support majority-minority districts to stop calling them the politics of the second best and call them politics. I want people to have a vocabulary for describing majority-minority districts and majority-minority schools. Like, just think of Seattle schools. Everybody in the Seattle schools cases, liberals and conservatives alike, termed those districts segregated. Those districts were racially integrated in lots of different ways. That is, they were heterogeneous. They just had different groups in the majority. There's a great example in the New York Times. in Nebraska, the one black legislator and a longtime civil rights guru helped, they were having trouble in one of their cities and they wanted to create districts, one majority black, one majority Latino, one majority white. Those districts were heterogeneous, but there were different groups in power. And that was the longtime civil rights advocates named Ernie Chambers supported this. So what does the New York Times report it is? Something like this, plan to promote segregated schools, comma, sparks controversy. I don't want the New York Times to be using the language of segregation. So the broader normative project is an effort to sort of normalize federalism and localism as a tool for empowerment of minorities and dissenters.
So I'm not from the US, and this is maybe why I'm wondering about this. So you say there's this nationalist mainstream account of what federalism does, and that's wrong, and you have your own view with a different rationale for decentralization. And you give a lot of examples where that's actually already happening, and there are positive examples that fit your view of the rationale. And when you get asked about schooling and text, you say you're actually fine with moving that out. So I'm wondering, in what instances would your view actually make a difference to constitutional practice as it stands now, and also to like specific constitutional doctrines as they stand now? How would they have to change?
Yeah, so I can give you a list if you'd like. Part of it is, so there's two parts to the project. One part is just kind of convincing, since there's a merry war right now between the federalism people and the nationalism people, I'm joining into that war and trying to convince the nationalism people that they're wrong. So that's just the plain old normative project. On the question of individual doctrine, I have a lot of pieces about it, so can I just give you some random examples? So one example, it is well accepted that when you create juries, you're allowed to disqualify that people who do not believe in the death penalty. When you're creating a jury to decide death penalties, you can disqualify jurors for cause because they oppose the death penalty. That makes perfect sense if you're thinking about juries as just kind of these, administrators of the law. That makes perfect sense. If you think of juries as robust democratic institutions, that would be as strange as disqualifying legislators. Have a death-eligible legislature, right? That's a strange thing, and yet that's routinely sort of accepted. I talked about Croson as an example this is the case about Virginia. The ways that the most recent example is Ricci. Justice Alito writes an incredibly giant opinion worrying about the ways that black politicians in New Haven are influencing the process, and everyone looks askance in that. So Justice Alito wants to push the doctrine in that direction. I'd like to block that. Commandeering is another example. So the conventional, all federalism people are against preemption as a general matter because they want the states to have more power. I'm not. I'm against preemption in some instances, but not others, and I have different rules than they do. They're against preemption because they think states should have more power. And I'm actually view as we should be selectively preemptive in thinking about these kinds of questions. Commandeering is another example. So most federalism scholars think commandeering is a bad idea. Because it violates state sovereignty and state autonomy. That's the kind of going rationale. Meanwhile, the nationalists are in favor of commandeering because they think that the national government should do whatever it wants. I actually have neither of those views. I think commandeering is a good thing because it ropes in dissenters into the administrative process. It forces people inside so that they'll be inside and engaged in a robust process of dissent. So there's another place where the doctrine, I just have different arguments about why the doctrine makes sense. So I'm against the commandeering rule. I'm happy to send you the papers, but there are a bunch of I can give you a bunch of small level doctrinal arguments. I can give you arguments about institutional design, about how we ought to think whenever we district. But most of the bigger project is about addressing what is going on in the academy and the debate in the academy. So that's the big fight. And I mostly spend most of my time on that fight rather than on the individual doctrinal examples. And maybe that's because I came to Yale. At Harvard, every paper always ended with a set of doctrinal examples. And when I got here, Bruce Ackerman said, never do that again. He said, never do it again because he says, you want to take the big questions on, and the little stuff, he says, will filter out. So I'm more grounded than that. I actually do like examples and I've just got a bunch of things in horizontal federalism now where I'm talking about how the doctrine would change. But mostly this project is really engaged in the bigger normative debate, and that's mostly where I think my aims are.
The concept of a loyal opposition implies that there is some boundary beyond which you're opposition but not so loyal.
Yep.
So the disloyal opposition, it also gets free speech, right? I don't know if the Nazis, you gave the example of Nazis in Skokie, I don't know if they're loyal or disloyal.
I would say disloyal, but...
They get to march. But you probably say that only the loyal opposition you would support accommodation to get participation.
Yep.
So that raises the problem, someone has to draw this line, and someone has to decide who's on which side.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, so I'll tell you about, I mean, one of the questions that I've always put off answering in this project, so I stumbled on this project when I was a really young scholar. I know I'm old now, but it's, you know, I had no idea what the project was about, to be frank. I didn't have the faintest idea what the project was. I just wrote a couple of articles to try to get my feet wet. And as I've written those articles over time, I now have a firmer sense of what the project is about, but I've always sort of dodged the big normative question about when can the loyal opposition act and when can't it. So I've done a lot of arguments about we ought to consider these things. I'll take the normative stance that these things matter and we should not help you think about how to balance them. But I've never sort of outlined that. And the reason I haven't done it is because I never felt like I really had a particularly good account to do it. Because if you look at the existing accounts, civil disobedience is the obvious place to go. But civil disobedience is talking about a very different thing, right? It's talking about people lying down on the pavement, but it's not talking about people making a decision, you know, putting someone in jail or not putting them in jail. So I felt like the stakes were so different that the civil disobedience literature only gets you so far. And I never really found something that I felt like I could wrap my hands around. I'm also not a philosopher, and it's not my strength. And so I wasn't ready to write that account of it. So I'm hoping, I'll just say this is where the work is in progress, I'm hoping actually that the notion of a loyal opposition helps me get through these kinds of questions. So I don't know if I have a full answer to yours yet, but the virtues of a loyal opposition is that it's an institutional idea. It's an idea that's about politics, both of which are things that I feel like I know how to do. So here's my short answer, that there is no perfect way to decide which opposition is loyal and which isn't. And that's why the First Amendment scholars always describe dissenters as a cipher, because for their purpose it doesn't matter who the dissenter is and what they do, because for their purpose they're not giving them that much. And so I think my guess is that there isn't actually a particularly good way to decide who the loyal opposition is, except in the way that we do for every other group, which is we have the fight at the national political level about what our values are. So just to give, you know, think about groups that I've been talking about on the equality front. That's how equality works. There are groups that we would have years ago thought were not entitled to equality rights of any sort, and it would never have occurred to anyone. That's why we have a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, right? That was a moment in time when people did not understand gay rights to be a meaningful idea. So we fought it out politically. It wasn't like we had some clean guiding line. You know, John Hart, Ely, Bruce Ackerman, 1,000 scholars have thrown themselves at it. And at the end of the day, as Bruce Ackerman says correctly, we have to have the moral fight. And I can't see I don't think I have a better solution than I don't have a clean conceptual set of categories for telling you who's loyal and who's not. I think we have to have the moral fight about national values, and that is really the only going to be, as a practical matter, that will be the only guide. But I actually don't think there is a better guide to give. If I had one, I would give it to you. But I think we have to have the moral fight. We have the moral fight, and once we have the moral fight, we know what national values are. Then we can make decisions about who's loyal and who's not. I'm actually supposed to stop.
So let's please thank Professor Gerken for his.
Thank you.